Hello and welcome to Social Media Business, the podcast about social media and business. Today I'm talking to Colby Brown. He's a photographer and he's a traveller. In fact, he does travel photography. He also works with not-for-profits. So he has a photography, travel, not-for-profit organisation that he works with called Giving Lens, and he runs education workshops. He's an entrepreneur and runs a business, and he's an amazing social media person. He's gone from 0 to 2.6 million followers on Google Plus, for instance, and he uses social media platforms in really interesting ways and potentially answering questions that photographers or anybody who creates original content has issues around. Have a look at what he says about owning the content, distributing the content, that sort of thing. So hopefully you'll find it enjoyable, and I really enjoyed talking to him. And see you inside the interview.
You like that?
Hello, Colby.
Hi.
Welcome to the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, Australia. Is this your first time here?
This is actually my second time here, but it's been about 10 years, so I don't really remember too much, to be fair.
Okay.
So.
And when was you last here?
It was I think 2003.
Okay.
Was the last time I was here, and I wasn't even into photography at the time. I was kind of just exploring around. It was one of my first big international trips, and which involved Australia as a part of it. I spent a few months here, and a piece of that was coming up here to the Blue Mountains with a group that I was traveling with at the time.
Okay.
So I definitely have a fun recollection, just not a wide, expansive one of the Blue Mountains. But I'm excited to be back.
So you were doing everything but photography here?
Yeah, pretty much. I was on a trip with a company called Pacific Challenge, and it was basically kind of adventure travel. So the whole time we were focused on Australia and New Zealand, and the idea was that we were skydiving and surfing and scuba diving and hang gliding and like jumping off bridges and doing crazy stuff. And then part of it is, of course, hanging out with the beautiful nature and doing hikes and treks and stuff. And so we came here to the Blue Mountains and did some hikes and did some rappelling, and it was
wow.
It was fun.
I have to say, my idea of the Blue Mountains is sitting in front of a fire. So when did you become involved in photography? Because you weren't involved back in the early 2000s. When did you become involved?
I got involved, now it's about 8-9 years ago. I initially actually got into photography not because of a passion for photography or the arts. It was actually because of travel. I really enjoyed traveling at the time. I already had a couple trips under my belt, including this trip to Australia we were just talking about, and kind of had gotten bit by the travel bug. And it was at a point in my life where I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and I came to the realization that I wanted to keep traveling. And I had a very naive notion at the time, but I was like, well, if I want to keep traveling, if I want to get paid for it, why don't I become a photographer? I had no background. I took one class in it when I was in 7th grade. But I was a little bit more interested in sports and girls at the time, so I don't think I paid attention. And yeah, it just kind of all
So
came
it's
together.
either photography or dancing, because
Yeah.
I always laugh at wherethehellismatt.com, and
Absolutely.
he danced his way around the
He
world
did.
and then got sponsorship to keep dancing. So if you're not a dancer, it's got to be photography.
It's one or the other. Either way, there's still ways to find success for sure.
So you started taking photographs, and what, initially you were putting them up online, or you were just showing your mum and dad, or what were you doing with your
Well, I
photographs?
think it's similar to what most photographers do. You kind of work within the small market that you have, and that's generally your family and friends, which is both a blessing and a curse. They help build up your confidence, but I think they're also not helping because they think every photo you take is amazing. So
I have the opposite experience here, but then again, I've got professional photographers around me who don't like my iPhone snaps.
Fair enough. It's all circular. I mean, it was initially when I decided I wanted to become a photographer. I really dove into it head first. I kind of committed to it. I bought camera. I had camera and lenses and a bunch of books, and I taught myself photography. And I soon found myself wanting to travel again, so I actually bought a one-way ticket to Southeast Asia, to Bangkok. And after about 5 months of kind of teaching myself the fundamentals of photography, I bought this flight, and on the flight over, the woman sitting next to me was a rock climber from Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And she'd been going out to the Railay Peninsula in southern Thailand for years in order to get married. Or she'd been going out there to climb and was going to get married because she fell in love with a local Thai. Long story short, her friend was a photographer that backed out at the last second. So my first paying gig ever was shooting a traditional Buddhist wedding in the middle of a rural village in southern Thailand.
Fantastic.
And then things kind of spurred from there. And at that point, it's like for a lot of photographers starting out, I was trying to build up a portfolio, take as many pictures as I could. At the same time, I was doing a lot of travel writing because I was trying to get into the industry. I didn't
Travel writing for traditional magazines, or were you blogging?
Mostly online publications.
Okay.
So this is, mid, 2005, 2006. This is about the time where the internet age started shifting a little bit more away from the .com and more into dynamic content. And I found myself from a publication standpoint, it was just easier for me to approach online publications in order to find interesting stories when I was traveling, basically write whatever I could. Part of it was to find my voice because I enjoyed writing as well, but didn't have a lot of practice with it. And then the other part was just to make a little extra cash on the side. I mean, I'd saved up enough money at this point to propel me for a few years, at least living kind of nomadically. Yep. But I was still kind of figuring out a lot of this.
So mid-2000s, would you say that you were building relationships with editors of online publications and that sort of thing?
I think not necessarily editors, because I never really, well, yes and no. I mean, I would do repeat business with certain periodicals or certain online publications, like the Sierra Club magazine, things like that. But all in all, it was more so finding that kind of creative vision for A, what I wanted to do, and B, kind of fine-tune some skills that I felt were going to be viable at some point. Of course, photography was part of this, so it was learning how to shoot travel photography and learning what type of images I like to shoot, how I like to edit, things like that, and at the same time bringing in the narrative side of things. And so at those times, I was definitely networking, but it wasn't so that I can continue doing travel writing. It was more so that I could continue to have my foot in the ground when it came to just continuing to travel. Just, it wasn't so important for me to make that connection with a travel editor as it was maybe with the magazine itself. Okay. So it was more of a long-term goal at the time because I knew I didn't want to just do travel writing. So it was kind of a mixture of all of it together.
Okay, so here you are, you're not penniless, but almost, traveling the world, picking up jobs here and there, doing things for travel magazines. And fast forward to today, and you've got 2.6 million followers on Google+. I don't know, whatever it is, 100-something thousand on Facebook, and you're running workshops around the world, and you're clearly connected into the communities. How did you make that jump? Because this is the big question everybody has, and it's not just photographers, but it's there's no point me getting started on social media because the top guys have already got millions of followers, as if it's a zero-sum economy because they're there, you can't be there as well. So what advice would you give photographers and anybody starting off in social media to get from a hobby and a passion to being somebody who's obviously a leader in the space?
Well, social media, as I think we're both well aware, is vitally important because it gives individuals like myself or companies or entities or brands the ability to personally connect with millions of people around the world that they might not have had the chance to otherwise at a smaller expense. There's always an expense, whether you want to talk financial or time investment or whatnot. I learned early on that social media was going to change things. I kind of had my ear to the ground and was just realizing the shifts that were happening because of advertising, marketing, and things changing like that. And so I was able to get out in front of some of these networks in terms of, I was on Facebook right when it came out, Google+, I was on it, the second day it came, it was privately available. First it was a public beta. And being conscious and aware of those things allowed me to get in early and build up more momentum easier.
Do you have an early story of where things started to click for you?
Well, if we backtrack a little bit more from a career standpoint, which I think is an important part of this, because social media, in my mind, is a piece of the machine. It's certainly not the machine. Yeah. If we backtrack a number of years to a few years after I had that first trip to Thailand, and I ended up living in Southeast Asia for about a year, picking up these odd jobs and building up a portfolio. A few trips after that, so say about fast forward to like 2.5 years after that, I was very fortunate and caught my first big break, and that was actually working for National Geographic. And what happened
That's a pretty big break.
It was a very big break, and that was
covering a wedding of somebody you met on a plane to covering National Geographic.
Absolutely,
is a big break.
Well, and it was. I mean, if I look at that first like wedding, and it certainly is a wedding for sure, but it was a very intimate cultural experience, and that really opened things up for me in terms of confidence, knowing that I was able to deliver on something that I was promised that I could, but it also gave me more of that kind of travel bug, and that whole mentality is what ultimately got me that job with National Geographic. And how it happened was a bit of persistence, a bit of luck, and a lot of timing, which I think is really key in any industry for any individual trying to make it. I had just come back from a trip to Nepal. I was doing some work in the Himalayas, where I was working with the Sherpas and doing some climbing around there. And waiting for me at my house in the U.S. was a pamphlet for National Geographic Student Expeditions. And I looked through it, and I was flipping through the different trips that they were offering, and I realized a lot of the trip leaders that they had for these trips didn't have as much travel experience as I had this time, because I was traveling for a few years. They certainly had more photographic experience. Why not? Why not try? Why not put myself out there? And so I made some phone calls and figured out who I needed to talk to, and put a resume together, sent it all in, took over a 3 or 4 month span of sending the application in, hearing back, setting up an interview, having an interview, and ultimately getting the job, where I was actually teaching photography for them in South America, particularly in Ecuador. And that, from a catalyst standpoint, was one of my big breaks. It was a resume pattern. National Geographic is highly sought after. If you ask any photographer that has any inkling for landscape or travel, specifically photography as far as the vertical, they say they want to work for Nat Geo. And it's true. It really opened up a lot of different doors. That to me was that shining, pump up moment where it really helped propel my career forward.
This is what I'm meant to be doing. This is going to work.
Absolutely. And at the same time, one that opened up so many more doors. Having that sitting there and saying, not only you worked for Nat Geo, but you were teaching photography for them, allowed you to have conversations that other people wouldn't have had if you didn't have that.
Yes.
So, and it wasn't like I was the most talented photographer or even probably the most traveled person at that time by any means, but I knew what I wanted. I was not afraid of failure. I didn't care if people said no to me. I figured out. And then things worked out, because I applied passion, I applied persistence, and I wanted to try to make it work. And I think once that happened and that opened up all these other doors, this was also at the same time that social media was really taking off. I mean, if you look back, Facebook 2005 was really kind of opened up outside of what Harvard's doors were started.
Yeah, anybody with an EDU domain was available, could use Facebook. And 2005, 2006,
2005,
December,
around there. And so, I mean, if you think about that, you think about, and the coming years after that, when Twitter and Instagram and Google Plus and all these things, it was, right now, or for my career specifically, it was a mixture of these variables coming together, allowing me the ability to create this career out of travel photography.
You were talking about you can go on Twitter and use a hashtag like USPS.
US or
like
USPS.
FedEx
Yeah,
or
whatever. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
FAO, and they'll get back to you. And I think one of the more interesting things for me with social media for companies is that they always seem to forget that the customer never lines up to speak to marketing and PR.
Yeah.
They always line up to speak to tech support or customer support,
right.
Customer service. So, who owns social media? The customer does, and they want customer service. But then if you don't have a need for customer service, you're a photographer who's starting out, or a small business that's starting out where you don't have heavy customer service requirements, how do you get started? Like, what is the shift? If you had a group of photographers you were speaking to and they said, why would I do social media? What would you say to them?
Well, the first question I think always comes down to, and this is not just for photography, it's certainly not endemic to it, it's asking yourself the question, why do I want to be on social media? And I think a lot of companies and a lot of individuals certainly don't ask that. If you're a photographer, for example, are you trying to get on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or any of these networks? Are you there to sell prints? Are you there to find clients? Are you doing wedding work? Are you wanting to teach workshops? Do you have an ebook to sell? Are you just looking for inspiration? Do you want to learn? You know, what is the reason?
Do you want to connect with your tribe, other photographers?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people just jump in. It's like Facebook. I have to be on Facebook, so I'm going to jump into Facebook. They don't cognitively think about the realities of why they're actually there. And just determining why someone is there, or a brand or an entity, helps give you that kind of first directional step and how to go off from there. And I think that's a really important lesson. I mean, if you look at, coming back to photography, if you're a event or wedding photographer, then from like a market demographic standpoint, as far as who's on these different platforms, Facebook probably is your best choice, just because of how content is shared on there and the type of individuals that are there. It's a closed network. Your friends, your family, things are there. If you're a photographer like myself that does a lot of photo education, Google Plus is a great place because it has a thriving photographic community, great interaction. Your images look great. They don't strip metadata. There's all these different variables that make it highly advantageous.
And then one of the questions I guess that I would have is, well, actually I have two. One is, do you have a top tip for Facebook for photographers? And the second question, and we'll come to the second one in a moment, but just to give you some space to think about, it would be, wouldn't you think that on Google Plus you're communicating with other photographers? In other words, you're consorting with frenemies. I have no problem with the frenemy, or the friendly enemy, the competitor, but are your clients there? So if we can go to the question number one, which would be the tips for Facebook
for sure.
First, what sort of things do you think photographers need to do on Facebook that maybe they wouldn't do on another platform or they haven't thought about?
It's probably hard to discern a number of things that you would do different from other networks, but certainly developing strategy is important. I think one of the biggest things that is not necessarily endemic to Facebook, but upload the highest quality photos that you can. Now, Facebook and Google Plus specifically are limited to resolutions of 2048 by 2048 as far as the largest that you can upload. Some photographers shy away from that because they worry about theft or other things, and that's a topic we can certainly talk about. I don't want to dive into it too much with answering this question, but uploading the best quality image that you can gives the best representation for the work that you're trying to put out there. When you're uploading from a desktop, from a laptop or a desktop computer, there's a little checkbox at the very bottom where it says upload high quality or high res version, and that basically will limit the compression that they do to images. It's known that Facebook is not so compression friendly to images. Sometimes it will compress them and add artifacts and other things.
In Australian, they're pretty crappy.
Yes, it's true. It's true.
And I know lots of people complain about it.
It happens a lot, for sure.
Or even with marketing material, trying to upload an infographic or something.
Figuring out the right dimensions that you need to upload that you're comfortable with.
There's a really good Facebook page called Cheat Sheet Dimensions.
Yeah.
And it tells you all the sizes
different
for
sizes.
The cover photo and everything.
For sure.
Okay.
Which makes a difference.
Do you find that you connect your content, your photos, to groups? Do you tag groups when you're uploading things to Facebook, or do you tend to do more the circles, which is like groups on Google Plus?
I do. For the most part, I do it just publicly. I certainly am part of a few groups on Facebook. Most of them are private facing though, and I find that approach for me as an individual, for where I am in my career, a little bit more advantageous than the big public groups. Like if I'm not going to sit there and post one of my photos here from the Blue Mountains to Blue Mountain Photographers Group. To me, I try to be as effective and efficient with my time with social media, because I think we all know it's also kind of a time suck. You can very easily wrap yourself up into it.
Well, if you're not buying attention, then you have to earn it.
Right.
And buying attention is physical dollars with advertising, and earning attention is bums on seat, finger on mouse or iPad,
getting it out there,
doing the work.
And it can be helpful. That's certainly coming back to the tips for Facebook. Finding ways that you can interact with that demographic that you're going after. And again, that kind of comes back to, are you selling prints? Who is your clientele? Do you have clientele? Are you just trying to learn? Are you just trying to connect with your tribe? If you're just trying to connect with your tribe, certainly join a couple of photography groups, Facebook photography groups, share some images, get some critiques, engage in relationships. I think, again, that comes back to the core. Whether a brand or an entity or an individual is there for customer service, for technical support, to learn, to sell, it all comes back to those personal relationships. And I think a lot of people, especially photographers, I don't know if it's because there's some sense of ego-driven aspect of photography, but people think that I have this image it's a beautiful image. I personally like it. I'm going to share it on the internet. Why isn't millions of people loving it? You know what I mean? And it just doesn't work that way.
Can I just say that it's exactly the same with companies with their campaigns. This is a fantastic campaign. Why
don't they love it?
Why don't they love it? And often one of the biggest failures in social media is not engaging with key influencer groups. So
Absolutely.
they put it up and they leave it there.
Yep.
There's plenty of gorgeous things on YouTube, on Flickr, no matter where, that doesn't get a lot of attention because it's not connecting into the tribes. They don't know about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
or they don't see it. Yeah,
They just doesn't magically get seeded into those communities.
I think taking away that kind of personal connection towards these campaigns or to individual content, I think, is a key aspect of social media in general. Mm-hmm. The fact that you love something does not mean that it's going to be universally loved, or it's going to go viral, or that 5 people like this image and 20 people like this, and that means that the image with 20 likes on Facebook is better than the other one.
There's
so many other variables into it.
They've got an active call to
action. Or
action.
the time that you post during the day.
Yeah,
there's all these variables that kind of come into play. So I think kind of removing that personal
side of things. But it's not luck. I mean, there is a methodology about this, With Google Plus, because it seems to me, looking at the numbers, that's where your core tribe are.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And is that because it's specifically photography, do you think? Or do you think...
I think it's a couple different reasons. I think the number one reason from a technical standpoint is that photography community, if we look at the internet as a whole at the time Google Plus came out, which was June of 2011, it was ripe for a new platform. People were getting fed up with Facebook. Flickr was starting to die out in terms of viability.
Well, it's Yahoo.
Yeah.
They've got no clue.
They're still figuring their things out. But across the board, it was just there was a space that was void that was waiting to be filled. And
I think Google bought Picasso or one of those.
Well, they have that, and they also have Paramio. They have some small communities, but I think as a whole, it was just kind of that convergence point where photographers wanted something. Google Plus came out. UI was nice. Images looked beautiful. It was clean. You didn't have the ads of Facebook. All these things came together, and so that photo community at the start when it first came out grew, and it got bigger and bigger.
It's huge. It's the second largest, most active social network now.
Absolutely.
Facebook's number 1. Google Plus is number 2.
For sure. In a short period of time.
And then is it LinkedIn and Twitter, or Twitter and LinkedIn?
I think it's Twitter and LinkedIn. They both keep kind of going back and forth. And I imagine in the next 2 years, it's going to be Instagram and
Instagram's
Snapchat and all these other ones.
Facebook's.
It's owned by them, but I usually still don't equate them out to the same piece.
Yeah, that's true.
But I think it's those things came together. And for me personally, while it became my biggest, is because I kind of dove into it. I again, keeping your ear to the ground. I mean, I've always, at some point, at least, consider myself more of an entrepreneur than a photographer specifically. Okay. So I'm always trying to keep my ear to the ground to figure out what social trends are happening out there, what's happening with technology, from the financial side of things, what companies do I want to partner with, and so thinking about that from an overall structure.
Do you think that's one of the trickiest things for particularly photographers, but we could probably extend this into other industries, is that you have to wear so many hats, and I don't think it's specific to social media, but it definitely makes social media easier. You have to be a marketing person, you have to be an entrepreneur person. You can't afford just to be a creative and just do your business, which is take photos.
Absolutely,
you've got to be all those other things.
If you look from the photography vertical, if you look at the most successful financially successful photographers in the industry, they are good artists. Some would even say great artists, a few of them. Mm-hmm. But they are better business people. And that's just the truth of the matter. And some photography, if you want to call them purists or idealists, or people that buy into the romanticized nature of photography as a career, might be upset with that. The reality is that taking quality images is a small portion of what it takes to make this as a career. I mean, I always use the analogy for 500px, another social network for photographers. Any photographer, any individual can go onto 500px and look for an hour and just browse through some of the most amazing, beautiful images they've ever seen in their life. And they'll see thousands of them. And then when that time is done, they'll look back and realize that of all those images that they saw, they will probably hear from maybe 3%. They'll see the names of the photographers of the images they looked at, maybe 3% of those people they saw. The reality is that taking beautiful images isn't, from a supply and demand situation, from where we are in the industry, where we are with technology, is no longer just the defining aspect. Like if you shoot at this level, that doesn't mean you're getting a work with National Geographic, because there's so many more people doing this. So you have to do these other aspects as well.
And in a sense, this is what marketing is. And as much as people diss marketing, it's about, it doesn't matter how brilliant your product is. If you don't tell the brand story, if you don't explain what this product is, if you don't have brand recall, if people don't remember the name of your brand, then it's fine if you want to do it as a hobby with a niche group, friends and family and your peers, and you want to stay a purist. But then don't get miffed when somebody else goes out mass market on social with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So one of the big questions, and maybe we'll finish up on this one, and it's the one that I have a lot in my workshops, and I have no doubt that you've heard it at least once in your life. How do I retain ownership, copyright of my images? How do I stop people from sharing them? Which is, as somebody who's more interested in getting the story out and the message out, I'm like, why don't you want people to show their friends and family your beautiful images? But I get it. The monetization tends to be hooked into the social object, which is the photo in this case. How do you answer that question?
I to be honest, I answer it a little bit differently, and sometimes it's not what photographers like to hear. Mostly people from that older generation. I'm more in line with you. For me personally, a few years ago, I realized what was happening with periodicals as far as like advertising dropping. They were paying less. I saw stock photography begin to dry up. I saw all these different aspects of specific financial revenue streams for photographers begin to become less viable. People weren't making as much money doing them. And when I started putting two and two together with these different pieces coming together, I realized that the value of a single image was dropping quite drastically. As an easy example, was it last year, 2 years ago? The cover of Time magazine was an image of Hurricane Sandy that came into New York and flooded New York. And the photo was of New Jersey that got damaged quite heavily. That photo was found on Instagram and was taken with an iPhone. And if you begin to realize that type of shift, with that, individual images becoming less valuable on their own in terms of like print sales and things like that, I made the business choice to change or shift the value of my images from more of a direct route, which is this image is worth $400 or $4,000 or whatever it is, to indirect route. So my images, print sales, image licensing, I still license images to National Geographic and Canon and Sony and all this other stuff, but it's a small portion, maybe 10% of my overall business revenue. Because of that allows me the fortitude to not directly worry about, oh, I'm going to share this photo on Facebook, and because I have such high numbers, 1,000 people are going to steal it. Or maybe some of the stuff that go viral on Google+, or just because of how pronounced I am on social media in general, there are at any point in time usually 5, 10, 15, 20,000 versions of my images on sites that I haven't approved because they get fined around.
But you're kind of protected because one of the things that we've found is that the people who are well known and their images are well known, the community dobs the other person in. We had a situation recently where a photographer was stealing images and putting them up on 500px and calling them his own. And then the community realised and were absolutely in uproar, and he's had to leave all the groups that he's been in. Right. So I think in some senses, those photographers that are not on social media don't have any protection, and that worries me too.
Absolutely. I think a lot of that still comes back to the core principle or difference. If we sit there and look at this individual, okay, so this individual is taking stuff from other photographers.
Very naughty.
And it's very naughty. It's very against the grain. A lot of people are very, get upset about this stuff. The question that I usually ask is, of all those images that he took and he stole, even if he was selling them, which he probably wasn't because he didn't have high enough resolution versions to sell them, was that hurting anyone's bottom line? Yeah. Was that shifting or changing? And if I look at my images, if I share an image and people know that I'm freely let them be distributed, I don't care if 10,000 times that image is taken and on blogs and on all this other stuff that are used for non-commercial reasons.
Non-commercial.
It makes no difference to me. And as you get more into social media, as you build up a following, as your numbers get higher, as your images get more and more shares, regardless if a watermark or not, or any of these other things. I don't watermark, by the way. It's going to happen more and more. So if it's going to happen
you
more and more...
You don't brand it? So at least if people were copying it...
I don't have to me... Okay, so I can sit there... So let's backtrack a little bit. So photography for me, from that overall circle, from the business side of things, selling prints and images, again, is a small portion of things. Mm-hmm. So the average photographer in the United States... a full-time photographer, professional, makes $32,000 a year, which isn't that much.
I just have to say, you probably don't know this, but our main newspaper group here in Australia just let go of hundreds of their photojournalists, and it's so sad. And they've had Save the Age and all sorts of events, and I almost feel like, in a sense, I don't know which industry organisation they should belong to, but they should be being helped to understand these shifts in monetization.
For sure. I mean, there's so much information online, and it's hard because, I mean, think about it from their perspective, and this happened in the U.S. as well. Chicago Sun-Times happened in Atlanta as well. A couple of big newspapers just sacked all their photographers. The reality is that it's certainly unfortunate. I'm certainly very, I don't want people to be out, certainly from what they love to do and whatnot. At the same time, looking at the overall sphere of everything, it's like this is another one of those variables, another one of these industry shifts that can't be stopped. Again, it comes back to or these news organizations all across the world are now getting images from iPhones, from peer reporters, from people just on the streets in Tehran and Syria and all this other stuff. And there's still a place for proper journalism, but the shift is happening, and photographers overall, for the overall spectrum, have to figure out, have to learn, have to rethink their approach to photography, because I think it's only going to get, if you want to use the term, worse, which I don't necessarily think it is, but it's definitely going to continue to shift. And there's no stopping. Technology is getting more and more advanced. Cameras are getting more affordable. People are taking higher quality images. Coming back to like monetization, people are giving away tons of work for free. I see all these photographers getting up in arms about it, and the reality is that that's not going to solve anything. Yeah. I bring it we're here in Australia, so let's bring it to a surf analogy. There are two types of people in the world when it comes to very broad spectrums, very big generalities. There's the individual that is constantly fighting the wave. They paddle out, they're constantly trying to fight the wave, they're trying to find that perfect wave.
That's not how it's always been done.
They get upset. Exactly. they're just focused on finding that perfect wave.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's photographers like myself and others out there in the industry that sit there and learn to ride the waves. We're not sitting there and we're just looking for that one perfect wave. We're sitting there and we're figuring out what variables are there. We figure out, instead of constantly fighting against the grain, we want to turn, we want to hit that wave. And I think that that's a very big key from how people have a negative connotation to all this. Like, things are happening, industry, photography, advertising, marketing, any of these different verticals are...
Banking, journalism, yes.
Absolutely, it's across the spectrum. All these industries are in a state of evolution.
Okay.
And because they're evolving, photographers, advertisers, bankers, all these other, everyone out there has to learn how to shift and change and adapt. And I think that's one of the biggest things with any sort of business, is to sit there and say, okay, this is the different steps that we have. This is how we've done it, but this is changing and we can't do this anymore. So how can we get ahead of the curve? How can we sit there and say, what is the next Pinterest? What is the next Instagram? If we come back to social media, from a photographic standpoint, what's the next technology that we can get involved with? How do we stay ahead of the grain of what's going on there and get our name out there?
What's the technology? What's the platform? And where will our customers be tomorrow, next week, in 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years? And it seems to me that's exactly what you've been doing. You started off not in photography, came to the Blue Mountains, ended up running fantastic workshops. I think you're doing a few this year in Iceland and places like that, which sounds awesome. And have been adapting and using the technology as you go along. And that's the key, isn't it? Just get started.
Absolutely.
Get started with friends and family, whether it's Google Plus or Facebook. Get in with your frenemies, with other photographers that you love their work and you want to talk to them about photography. Learn what you can, and eventually you'll find your voice in these spaces.
Well, and engage. I think that's coming back to the social media standpoint. I think people forget that's social. It's like a big part of this whole thing. And if you share a photo, talk about it. Engage with people that have chosen to follow you or engage with you. You'll build up that camaraderie. You'll build up a small community,
and you'll learn a lot about what they like and what they're thinking.
I mean, that's how it all happens. It's the spiral. It's the snowball nature of social media. You sit there and get a small group of individuals, and they like your stuff, and they engage with it, and then that goes into a bigger group, and a bigger group, and a bigger group. But you have to start somewhere.
Excellent. I wanted to give you this book, which is Google Plus for photographers, and then I realised you wrote it. We actually have 2 or 3 copies in our house. So Google Plus for photographers, it's a great book. I actually got it because I was interested in the Google Plus tips in here. And, you know, you've got a lot of things that we apply to other platforms, and you definitely applied them here. And then photographers themselves would like it for the photography, social media aspect. Thank you so much for participating today.
My
really
pleasure.
Interesting, really enjoyed it. And how long are you here in the Blue Mountains for?
Just a couple more days, and I'm actually back for Vivid Sydney.
So, Vivid,
and then across the pond over to Perth. And
so
then
when are you down at Vivid taking photos of the harbour?
That should be Wednesday and Thursday night.
Thursday. Okay, cool. Excellent. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.